The Italian leather shoes weren't made for running through Caribbean airports. Tim Garland's lungs burned as he watched his connecting flight disappear into the night sky, taking his entire future with it. 8 years of building his independence, 47 deals that had proven he could succeed without family money, and now everything hung in the balance because of a briefcase he'd forgotten in his rush to leave. The taxi ride back to the hotel felt like a funeral procession. Every red light, every delay, another piece of his carefully constructed life slipping away. When he burst through the lobby doors, chest heaving and designer suit wrinkled with panic, the hotel was tomb quiet except for the soft glow of the reception desk. A woman looked up from her computer, dark eyes taking in his expensive desperation with something that might have been amusement. When she smiled, Tim felt something shift in his chest, not relief, but recognition of a trap he was already caught in. "Mr. Garland," she said, her voice carrying the musical lilt of the islands, "I was wondering when you'd be back." Tim straightened his tie, trying to salvage some dignity. "Ms. Greenidge, Asha Greenidge." She moved with fluid grace around the desk, her professional elegance somehow making his expensive clothes feel cheap. "You left this behind." She held up his briefcase, the one containing contracts worth more than some small country's GDP. Relief flooded through him so powerfully, his knees nearly buckled. "Thank God, I thought that your entire empire would crumble without it." Her tone remained pleasant, but something sharp glinted in her eyes. Funny how a man can build 47 properties across the Caribbean and still panic over one forgotten bag. Tim's hand froze halfway to the briefcase. How did she know his acquisition count? He'd never mentioned it, and those numbers weren't public record. "I'm sorry, what did you say?" Asha's smile widened, revealing perfect white teeth that somehow reminded him of a shark. "Oh, Mr. Garland, we know exactly who you are." She gestured toward the lobby seating area, where several elderly guests sat with newspapers and rum punches. "Mrs. Allain there? Her sister Margaret owns Palm Court Hotel in Christchurch. The Johnsons? Their family runs Blue Waters Lodge in Oistins." Tim's blood turned cold. These weren't random hotel guests. They were the competition. The property owners he'd been planning to outbid and acquire tomorrow morning. "The Clarks from Sunset Villa Inn," Asha continued conversationally, as if discussing the weather. "The Thornfields from Coral Reef Inn. The Baptistes from Tradewinds Guest House." Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "And my grandfather, Winston, who built Seabreeze Guest House with his own hands in 1963. The briefcase suddenly felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Tim set it down carefully, his mind racing through calculations and exit strategies. "I see. And you're here because?" "Because tomorrow morning, the Barbados Heritage and Tourism Review Board will decide whether your acquisition applications meet community benefit standards." Asha's professional mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something fierce and protective underneath. 6 families, Mr. Garland. 6 generations of hospitality, cultural preservation, and community employment, all hanging in the balance while you chase your 200th million. Tim's phone buzzed. Another message from Marcus Thompson, his business partner, demanding updates on the Barbados portfolio. Tim silenced it without reading, his fingers trembling slightly. "How do you know about the 200 million target, the retirement plan at 40, your father's net worth when he left Garland Maritime?" Asha pulled out a manila folder, thick with documents. "Mr. Garland, when a foreign developer shows up wanting to buy 6 properties in one sweep, we do our homework. Have you ever met someone who challenged everything you thought success meant?" The lobby had grown quieter, the elderly guests pretending to read their newspapers while clearly listening to every word. Tim realized he was being surrounded, evaluated, judged by people whose entire lives he'd planned to disrupt with a few signatures and wire transfers. "I run a legitimate business," he said carefully. "Everything I do is legal." "Legal, yes." Asha opened the folder, revealing photographs of demolished buildings, displaced families, construction sites where homes used to stand. The Martinez family in Aruba. Evicted after 40 years when you acquired their inn for luxury resort development. The Thompsons in Antigua, whose fishing business disappeared when your beachfront hotel blocked their boat access. Tim's chest tightened. Those were just business decisions. Market efficiency, supply and demand. I offered fair market value for those properties. Fair market value. Asha repeated the words like they tasted bitter. Mr. Martinez was 73 years old, Mr. Garland. His inn was his pension, his legacy for his grandchildren. Your fair market value bought him a one-bedroom apartment in a retirement community where he died of a stroke 6 months later. The photographs blurred slightly. Tim blinked hard, forcing himself to focus. These were emotional manipulations, sob stories designed to undermine his business judgment. Real estate development creates jobs, increases property values, brings investment to local economies. Whose economy? One of the elderly men, tall and weathered with kind eyes, stood up slowly. Winston Greenidge, he introduced himself, extending a calloused hand. Asha's grandfather. Built this place when she was just a dream in her parents' minds. Tim shook the offered hand, surprised by its strength. Mr. Greenidge. I understand you've received our acquisition offer. Oh yes, Winston smiled warmly. 3 times what we paid for the land in 1963. Enough to buy a nice little condo in Bridgetown and live comfortable for our remaining years. His smile faded. But what happens to the Denisons? Young couple, been working here 15 years, saving for their own place. Or Miss Catherine, cleans the rooms, sends money to her daughter in university in Canada. Where do they go when this becomes another luxury resort? Tim's phone buzzed again. Marcus, increasingly urgent. The Shangri-La Group wanted an answer on their partnership offer by midnight, Eastern Standard Time. $250 million. Instant wealth beyond anything Tim had imagined when he'd started this crusade to prove himself. But the offer depended on the Barbados acquisition being completed by tomorrow afternoon. Mr. Greenidge, I understand your concerns, but business decisions can't be made based on emotion. But instead of opening it, Tim found himself staring at his reflection in the polished elevator doors. When was the last time someone had offered to cook him breakfast? When was the last time anyone had looked at him and seen someone who needed feeding, caring for, nurturing? His mother's voice echoed in his memory. I'll be back soon, Timmy, I promise. 23 years later, he was still waiting. Tim woke to the sound of steel drums and the smell of something extraordinary drifting through his window. He'd spent the night reading the documents Asha had given him, learning the names and stories of every person his acquisition would displace. Miguel Santos, who worked at Blue Waters Lodge for 30 years. Patricia Thornfield, who'd used her nursing skills to help guests with medical emergencies. Joyce Baptiste, whose tourism board connections brought cultural groups to Tradewinds Guest House for authentic Bajan experiences. Real people, real lives, real consequences. His phone showed 43 missed calls from Marcus, but Tim silenced it without listening to the voicemails. Whatever his partner had to say could wait until after breakfast. The hotel's dining area had been transformed. Tables pushed together, family-style seating. And Winston Greenidge presiding over a massive spread of flying fish, cuckoo, cassava bread and fruit, so fresh it still held morning dew. The elderly guests from last night were there, but now Tim could see they weren't guests at all. They were family, gathered to share a meal and evaluate the stranger who held Not yet, Asha's voice came from behind him. She set down a pitcher of fresh mango juice and took the seat across from him. This morning she wore a simple sundress that somehow made her more beautiful than any designer gown could have. Her grandmother's pearl earrings caught the morning light. But Grandpa believes everyone deserves a chance to become family. Tim picked up his fork, surprised by how hungry he actually was. The flying fish was perfectly seasoned, the cuckoo creamy and comforting. Around the table, conversation flowed easily. Grandchildren's accomplishments, plans for the upcoming crop season, gentle teasing about whose breadfruit trees produced the largest fruit. Mr. Garland, Margaret Allen said kindly, tell us about your family. Are your parents still living? Tim's fork stilled halfway to his mouth. My father lives in Connecticut. Remarried. Has 2 young children with his new wife. My mother. He cleared his throat. I haven't spoken to my mother in several years. The table grew quiet, not awkward, but attentive. These people understood family complications, Tim realized. Real families with real problems, not the pristine nuclear units from his prep school classmates. Sometimes, Winston said gently, the people who leave us teach us the most about staying. Tim looked up, startled by the insight. Around the table, faces showed understanding, not judgment. The tourism board meeting was still 18 hours away, but Tim felt like his entire future was being decided over flying fish and cuckoo. Patricia Thornfield nodded slowly. My first husband left when our son was diagnosed with special needs. Thought I'd never trust anyone again. But George proved that not all men run from difficulty. Running isn't always about cowardice, Asha said softly, her eyes meeting Tim's across the table. Sometimes it's about being afraid to hope. Tim's chest tightened. How could she possibly understand? My mother promised she'd come back. Every day for 3 years I waited by the window after school. My father finally sold the house because he said watching me wait was breaking his heart. The silence that followed wasn't pitying, but respectful, honoring the weight of that childhood pain. Winston reached across the table and covered Tim's hand with his own. Son, some people leave because they're broken, not because we're not worth staying for. Tim's phone buzzed urgently. Marcus again. Tim glanced at the screen and saw final warning in the subject line, the found he couldn't bring himself to care. This kitchen, these people, this sense of belonging he'd never experienced. How could he put a dollar value on something so rare? The tourism board meeting, he said finally. What exactly happens there? Community review process, Asha explained, her professional competence seamlessly returning. Each property owner presents their case for keeping their license. Foreign developers present their plans for community benefit, employment preservation, cultural integration. And if I withdraw my applications? Joyce Baptiste leaned forward. Mr. Garland, we're not asking you to sacrifice your business interests. We're asking you to partner with us instead of displacing us. Partnership? Tim set down his coffee cup. I don't understand. Sustainable tourism development, Asha said, and suddenly Tim could see the brilliant hospitality manager she'd once been. Keep the existing hotels as anchors for authentic Bayesian experiences. Your capital, our expertise, shared profits that stay in the community. Tim's mind raced through the financial implications, smaller profit margins, longer-term investment. Success dependent on community cooperation rather than market domination. Everything his business training said to avoid. Everything his frozen heart said to embrace. I'd need to make some calls, he said slowly. Of course, Winston smiled. But first, help me with the dishes. Man who eats at my table helps clean up after. Tim found himself laughing for the first time in months. Mr. Greenidge, I've never washed a dish in my life. Well then, Asha stood and began gathering plates, her hip brushing Tim's shoulder as she moved. The contact sent electricity through his entire body. Time he learned something new. In the kitchen, Winston directed Tim through the basics of dishwashing while Asha dried and put away. Their movements created an intimate dance. Tim hyper-aware of every time Asha reached past him, every moment their hands touched passing dishes, every smile she offered when he fumbled with soap bubbles. Tell me about Clayton Webb, he said suddenly, the name emerging from the research he'd done on Asha's background. Asha's hand stilled on the dish towel. Winston's expression darkened. Clayton was a developer from Trinidad, she said carefully. Promised community investment, cultural preservation, employment protection. Used my connections and local knowledge to gain trust, then built luxury condos that displaced 12 families. And you were involved with him personally? I was young and believed in his vision. Asha's voice carried pain she was trying to hide. Believed in him. When I realized what he was really doing, I tried to stop the project. He said I was being naive. That sentiment has no place in business. Tim felt something cold settle in his stomach. How many times had he said similar words? How many Clayton Webbs had he been to communities across the Caribbean? "That's when you quit Hilton and came home," he said. "That's when I learned the difference between developing communities and developing profits." She turned to face him directly. "The question is, Mr. Garland, which one are you here to do?" Tim's phone buzzed again. Marcus, probably threatening to dissolve their partnership if Tim didn't return his call soon. The Shangri-La deal, that would set him up for life, allowed him to retire at 40 with his target $200 million, prove once and for all that he could succeed without family money. But looking at Asha, seeing the hope and wariness warring in her dark eyes, feeling the warmth of Winston's approval, Tim realized something had shifted fundamentally. The old goals suddenly felt hollow, meaningless. "I want to see all 6 properties," he said, "before the meeting. I want to understand what I'd be buying." Asha's smile could have powered the entire island. "Mr. Garland, I'd be honored to give you the tour." The tour began at Sunset Villa Inn, where Samuel and Bernice Clark had transformed a colonial-era house into a cultural experience center. Samuel, despite needing a walking stick due to his diabetes complications, guided Tim through rooms displaying traditional Bajan crafts, local artwork, and historical artifacts. "We don't just put tourists in beds," Samuel explained, his voice carrying the dignity of a retired teacher. "We educate them about our heritage. This room here showcases traditional chattel house construction. Tourists learn how our ancestors designed homes that could be moved when plantation owners decided to relocate workers." Tim examined the intricate woodwork, the ingenious joinery that required no nails. "This is remarkable craftsmanship. My great-grandfather built houses like this," Samuel smiled proudly. "Skills passed down through generations. When developers tear down old properties for modern resorts, you lose that knowledge forever." In the garden, Bernice showed Tim her herb collection, medicinal plants still used by island elders, seasoning herbs that created the authentic flavors tourists craved. "These recipes came from my grandmother and her grandmother before that. 4 generations of women teaching their daughters how to heal with nature." Tim found himself fascinated despite his usual impatience with sentiment. This wasn't just a business. It was a living museum, a cultural preservation project, a family legacy. When Samuel mentioned needing $800 monthly for medication, Tim understood the impossible choice: sell to developers and lose everything the family had built, or struggle financially while preserving their heritage. At Blue Waters Lodge, the Johnson family told stories that made Tim's chest ache. Great-grandfather Jeremiah Johnson had been born into slavery on a nearby plantation. After emancipation, he'd worked as a fisherman for 40 years to buy this land, 1 acre at a time. "See that foundation there?" Young Marcus Johnson, probably 25, pointed to stone remnants near the beach. "That's where my great-great-grandfather built his first house. He used to say, 'Once you own land, nobody can make you move again.'" The irony wasn't lost on Tim. Here he was representing exactly the kind of forced displacement Jeremiah Johnson had fought to escape. 3 generations of Johnsons had built this property into a sustainable business that employed their neighbors, supported local fishermen by serving their catch, and taught visitors about authentic island life. "Mr. Garland," Marcus Johnson said quietly, as they watched children playing on the beach, "my son is 6 years old. I want him to grow up knowing his history, understanding that his family built something lasting. If you buy this land for resort development, what legacy do I leave him?" Tim's throat felt tight. At 6 years old, he'd been watching his mother pack suitcases, promising she'd be back soon. What might his life have been like if he'd grown up with that kind of generational stability, that bone-deep knowledge of belonging somewhere? Palm Court Hotel broke his heart completely. Margaret Alleyne, whose sister Grace had been at breakfast, showed Tim through 15 rooms that housed long-term guests, elderly visitors who returned year after year, treating the hotel like a second home. "Mr. and Mrs. Peterson from Toronto," Margaret pointed to an elderly couple reading on the veranda. "Been coming here every winter for 23 years. They brought their children when they were young. Now they bring their grandchildren. This isn't just accommodation, it's family tradition." In the manager's office, Margaret showed Tim medical bills, insurance forms, receipts for her son David's special therapy sessions. David, now 35 with Down syndrome, worked at the hotel doing housekeeping, his salary carefully managed to supplement his disability benefits. David's been working here since he was 18, Margaret said proudly. Guests know him by name, ask about his pottery classes. Bring him postcards from their travels. This job gives him purpose, community, dignity. Where does he go if this becomes a luxury resort that requires professional standards he can't meet? Tim watched David carefully folding towels, his face bright with concentration and pride. The young man noticed Tim watching and waved enthusiastically. "You're the American man," David said happily. "Mama says you might buy our hotel. Will you keep my job? I'm a very good worker." Tim's composure finally cracked. "Yes," he said hoarsely. "You're an excellent worker, David." By the time they reached Tradewind's guest house, Tim felt emotionally raw. Michael and Joyce Baptiste had created partnerships with local artisans, musicians, and cultural groups. Guests didn't just stay at the hotel. They participated in steel drum workshops, learned traditional dance, visited local markets with guides who were actual community members rather than hired performers. "Tourism should benefit everyone," Joyce explained, as they watched a group of visitors learning to prepare traditional Bajan dishes with elderly island women. Not just hotel owners and international corporations. Michael showed Tim employment records, 12 local people earning steady income, plus rotating opportunities for artists, musicians, and cultural educators. When international resort chains moved in, those jobs disappeared, replaced by minimum wage positions controlled by foreign management. As they drove back to Seabreeze guest house, Tim and Asha sat in contemplative silence. The weight of what he'd seen, the stories he'd heard, the faces of people whose lives hung in the balance. It was overwhelming. "No, you understand," Asha said finally. "What Clayton Webb destroyed. What you have the power to destroy or preserve." Tim's phone had been buzzing constantly throughout the tour. Marcus had left increasingly frantic voicemails. The Shangri-La partnership deadline was approaching, and Tim's silence was threatening everything he'd worked 8 years to build. But sitting beside Asha, still feeling the warmth of David Alleen's enthusiastic handshake, still hearing Samuel Clarke's pride in his cultural preservation work, Tim realized his priorities had shifted completely. "Asha," he said quietly, "there's something I need to tell you, something that changes everything." She pulled into the Seabreeze parking area and turned to face him. Afternoon sunlight highlighting the elegant line of her throat, the intelligence in her dark eyes. "What is it?" "I have a partnership offer. Shangri-La Hotels wants to buy into my development portfolio for $250 million. The deal depends on completing the Barbados acquisition by tomorrow afternoon." Asha's face went carefully blank. "I see. If I withdraw my applications, I lose everything. 8 years of building my independence, proving I could succeed without family money. I'd have to start over completely." The silence stretched between them, heavy with implications. Finally, Asha spoke, her voice professionally neutral. "Then you should take the deal, Mr. Garland. $250 million is life-changing money." "It is," Tim agreed. "But so is this." He gestured toward the hotel, the community, the sense of belonging he'd discovered in one breakfast conversation. "What if I chose differently? What if I chose you?" Asha's composure cracked slightly. "Mr. Garland, Tim. My name is Tim." He turned to face her fully. "And I'm not talking about the business deal, Asha. I'm talking about the way you made me feel this morning, when you looked at me like I was someone worth cooking breakfast for. The way your grandfather welcomed me like family. The way this whole community showed me what it means to build something lasting instead of just profitable." "You've known me for 18 hours, she said, but her voice was softer now. "Clayton Webb knew you longer than that," Tim pointed out. "Time doesn't guarantee character, Asha. But choices do." His phone rang. Marcus Thompson, probably making one final attempt to salvage their partnership. Tim looked at the caller ID, then deliberately powered off the phone. "There," he said. "Choice made." Asha stared at him in amazement. "Tim, you can't what? Can't choose something meaningful over something profitable? Can't decide that some things are worth more than money?" He reached across the car's console and gently took her hand. "Can't fall for a woman who's intelligent enough to see through my defenses and brave enough to call me on my mistakes." Her fingers tightened around his. You don't understand what you'd be giving up, don't I? Tim brought her hand to his, pressing a soft kiss to her knuckles. Asha, I've spent 8 years accumulating wealth and 39 years running from attachment. I'm tired of being afraid to stay somewhere, afraid to care about someone, afraid to build something that matters more than my bank balance. And if you regret it, if you wake up tomorrow and realize you've made a terrible mistake. Tim looked into her eyes, seeing hope and fear warring there, and realized he'd never been more certain of anything in his life. Then I'll deal with the consequences, but I won't regret choosing love over fear, community over isolation, or you over everything else. For a long moment, they sat holding hands in the car, the weight of his decision settling between them. Then Asha smiled, the expression transforming her face with radiant joy. In that case, she said, Grandpa was right. We should cook you dinner tonight. You're going to need your strength for tomorrow's meeting. As they walked toward the hotel together, Tim felt something he hadn't experienced since childhood. The bone-deep certainty of being exactly where he belonged. Have you ever had to choose between everything you worked for and everything that mattered? Share your experience with our Royal Story family in the comments. That evening, the Seabreeze kitchen became the center of Tim's education in what family actually meant. Winston Greenidge proved to be not just a gracious host but a master chef, guiding Tim through the preparation of traditional Bajan cuisine with patience and gentle humor. First lesson, Winston said, tying an apron around Tim's expensive linen shirt. Cooking is about love, not perfection. You burn the onions, you start again. You oversalt the fish, you add more fish. But you never, ever cook without putting your heart into it. Tim, who had never prepared anything more complex than instant coffee, found himself chopping vegetables under Winston's watchful eye, while Asha prepared flying fish with practiced expertise. The kitchen filled with the sounds of conversation, laughter, and steel drum music playing softly from an old radio. Tell me about your mother, Winston said quietly as they worked side by side. Asha mentioned you haven't spoken in years. Tim's knife paused over the onions. She left when I was 8, promised to come back, never did. My father said she had problems, mental health issues, but she never tried to contact me, not even when I graduated college or started my business. Ah, Winston nodded sagely. And so you learned not to wait for people to come back. I learned to stay anywhere long enough to be left again. Tim corrected. Same thing, different direction. Winston handed Tim a bowl of seasoning. But sometimes, son, staying is how we heal the leaving. Across the kitchen, Asha was teaching Margaret Allen's daughter how to bread the fish properly, their heads bent together in concentration. Tim watched the easy affection between them, the way Asha naturally included the younger woman in the cooking process, and felt something shift in his chest. She's special, Winston observed, following Tim's gaze. Lost her way for a while after that Clayton business, but she found herself again. Question is, have you found yourself? Before Tim could answer, Asha appeared at his side, flour dusting her dark hands, a smudge of seasoning on her cheek. Without thinking, Tim reached up and gently wiped it away with his thumb. The intimate gesture sparked electricity between them that had nothing to do with the storm clouds gathering outside. We should check on the bread, she said softly, but neither of them moved. Winston cleared his throat meaningfully. I think these old bones need to rest for a while. Asha, child, show Tim how to properly season the fish, and don't let him burn my kitchen down. Alone together in the steamy kitchen, the atmosphere became charged with awareness. Asha guided Tim's hands as he rubbed spices into the fish, her touch sending fire through his nervous system. When thunder rumbled overhead, she moved closer, supposedly to show him proper knife technique, but really because the space between them had become magnetic. Tell me about Clayton, Tim said, his voice rougher than intended. Asha's hand stilled. What do you want to know? How he convinced you to trust him. How he made you believe in his vision. She was quiet for a long moment, focusing intently on her knife work. He was charming, sophisticated, talked about sustainable development, community partnerships, cultural preservation, everything I'd studied in hospitality management, Everything I believed tourism should be. And personally? Personally, he made me feel like I was part of something bigger than myself, like my ideas mattered, my community connections were valuable, like I was brilliant and beautiful, and essential to his success. She set down the knife and turned to face Tim. Until I realized I was just useful. Local knowledge, family connections, community trust, all tools for his actual agenda. Tim stepped closer, drawn by the pain in her voice. And when you realized, I confronted him, told him the community felt betrayed, that this wasn't what he'd promised. He said I was being naive, that business decisions couldn't be made based on emotion, that he'd never promised to preserve anything except his profit margins. The words hit Tim like physical blows, because he recognized them, had probably spoken similar phrases himself. Asha, the worst part wasn't the betrayal, she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. It was realizing I'd been the instrument of it. I'd convinced my family, my neighbors, my community to trust him because I trusted him. 12 families lost their homes because I vouched for a man I didn't really know. Lightning flashed outside, illuminating the kitchen in stark black and white. In that moment, Tim saw himself clearly. Another Clayton Webb, another charming developer, with promises that served his agenda more than the community's needs. Is that what you think I am? He asked quietly. Another Clayton? Asha studied his face in the flickering candlelight. I don't know yet. That's what terrifies me. The honest answer hung between them, like a challenge. Tim could have offered reassurances, made promises about his changed intentions, sworn that he was different. Instead, he stepped closer and cupped her face in his hands. Then let me prove it, he said softly. Not with words, but with choices. Not with promises, but with actions. For a heartbeat, they stood frozen, the air between them crackling with tension and possibility. Then, Asha rose on her toes and kissed him, soft and tentative at first, then with growing passion as Tim's arms came around her. The kiss tasted like hope and fear, like spices and sweetness, like the beginning of something that could either heal them both or destroy them completely. When they finally broke apart, both were gasping. This is dangerous, Asha whispered against his lips. Everything worthwhile is dangerous, Tim replied, then kissed her again, deeper this time, until thunder crashed overhead and they broke apart, laughing breathlessly. We should check on dinner, Asha said, but her arms remained around his neck. We should, Tim agreed, but instead of moving away, he pulled her closer. In a minute, the storm outside mirrored the tempest in Tim's chest. Everything he'd thought he wanted, everything he'd worked toward, all of it suddenly seeming less important than this woman in his arms and the community that had welcomed him like family. His phone, forgotten on the counter, buzzed with another call from Marcus. But Tim didn't even glance at it. For the first time in his adult life, he was exactly where he belonged. The dinner that followed was unlike anything Tim had ever experienced. 6 families gathered around tables pushed together in the Seabreeze dining room. Sharing food, stories, and genuine warmth that money couldn't buy. Children played between the tables while adults discussed everything from crop rotation to cricket scores, treating Tim not as a wealthy outsider, but as a welcomed guest. Mr. Tim, David Alleyne called out from across the room, his face bright with excitement. Will you play dominoes with us? Tim looked helplessly at Asha, who grinned and pushed him toward the game table. Fair warning, David's a domino shark. He's beaten every tourist who's challenged him for the past 5 years. As Tim learned the intricacies of Caribbean dominoes, losing spectacularly, while David and the other men good-naturedly coached him through the rules, he felt something long frozen in his chest beginning to thaw. This was what family felt like, not the careful politeness of country club dinners or the strategic networking of business events, but genuine inclusion, teasing affection, and the security of being accepted exactly as he was. You're getting better, Samuel Clark encouraged as Tim managed to win a hand. By the time you've been here a month, you might actually provide some competition. A month? Tim caught Asha's eye across the room where she was helping clear dishes. I like the sound of that. Later, as the evening wound down and families headed home to prepare for tomorrow's crucial meeting, Winston appeared at Tim's elbow with 2 cups of coffee and a knowing smile. Walk with me, son, he said. leading Tim out to the hotel's garden where flowering trees released perfume into the warm night air. They settled on a bench that faced the ocean, waves providing gentle background music to their conversation. Winston sipped his coffee thoughtfully before speaking. 60 years ago, I proposed to Asha's grandmother, right here in this garden, he said. Scared to death she'd say no. Terrified she'd say yes. Love makes cowards of us all, one way or another. Tim's chest tightened. Mr. Greenidge, Winston, we're past formalities now. The older man's eyes crinkled with humor. You love her. It wasn't a question, but Tim answered anyway. I've known her for 2 days. And how long did it take you to decide to buy 6 hotels? Winston asked mildly. 2 weeks of research? Professional assessment? Market analysis? Actually, about 30 minutes on the plane, Tim admitted. I saw the portfolio summary and knew it was exactly what I needed for the Shangri-La deal. Ah, so you trust your instincts in business, but not in love? Tim stared out at the moonlight dancing on waves, searching for words to explain the fear that had ruled his life for 30 years. In business, if I make a mistake, I lose money. In love, if you make a mistake, you lose yourself. Winston finished gently. But son, if you don't take the risk, you lose yourself anyway. Just slower, lonelier. The wisdom in those simple words hit Tim like a physical blow. How many years had he spent running from connection, building wealth instead of relationships, accumulating success while starving his soul? She's terrified I'll turn out to be another Clayton Webb, Tim said quietly. And you're terrified she'll turn out to be another person who leaves. Winston nodded sagely. Fear makes people do stupid things. Question is, which fear are you going to choose? The fear of loving her or the fear of losing her? Before Tim could answer, Asha appeared in the garden doorway, silhouetted against the warm light from the hotel. She'd changed into a simple dress that flowed around her curves like water, her hair loose around her shoulders, and Tim's breath caught at her beauty. Grandpa, stop interrogating the poor man, she called teasingly. Tim, would you like to see the cottage? It's where I grew up, just down the beach. Winston chuckled and patted Tim's shoulder. Go on, son. Some conversations need moonlight and privacy. The cottage sat nestled between sea grapes and coconut palms. A perfect example of traditional Barbadian architecture, updated with modern comfort. Asha led Tim through rooms filled with family photographs, local artwork, and books that revealed her passion for sustainable tourism development. This was my parents' room, she said, showing him a bedroom with windows that opened directly onto the beach. They died in a car accident when I was 16. Grandpa moved me into the cottage so I could have space to grieve while still being close to family. Tim studied photographs of a younger Asha with a couple who shared her intelligent eyes and warm smile. They would have been proud of what you've accomplished. Would they? Asha sank onto the window seat, moonlight painting silver highlights in her dark hair. I fell for Clayton's lies, helped him gain the community's trust, then watched him betray everyone I loved. Some accomplishment. Tim sat beside her, close enough to feel her warmth, but careful not to crowd her. You were young and believed in someone who lied to you. That doesn't make you naive. It makes you human. Does it? She turned to face him, vulnerability shining in her dark eyes. The question hung between them like a challenge. Outside, waves whispered against the shore, and palm fronds rustled in the trade winds. Inside the cottage, 2 people who had built walls around their hearts sat on the edge of tearing them down. I have something to show you, Tim said quietly. He pulled out his phone and scrolled to his email, finding the folder he'd never opened. Letters from my mother, 17 of them over the past 10 years. I've never read a single one. Asha stared at the phone screen, understanding flooding her face. Oh, Tim. I was so afraid she'd reject me again that I rejected her first. Better to assume she didn't care than risk finding out she still didn't want me. His voice cracked slightly. Sound familiar? For a long moment, they sat in silence, each recognizing their own fears reflected in the other's story. Then Asha reached for the phone. Would you like to read one together? She asked softly. Sometimes courage is easier when you're not alone. Tim's hand trembled as he opened the most recent email. The timestamp showed it had been sent 3 weeks ago, just days before he'd gotten the Barbados portfolio that had brought him here. "My dearest Timothy," Asha read aloud, her voice gentle. "Another year has passed, and I still don't know if you read these letters or if they disappear into digital space, like messages in bottles thrown into an endless ocean. But I keep writing them, hoping that someday you'll want to hear what I have to say. I know I hurt you terribly by leaving. I know I broke promises that a mother should never break. I was sick, Timothy, sicker than your father knew, sicker than I understood at the time. The doctors said it was severe postpartum depression complicated by bipolar disorder, but those clinical terms don't explain the fog that made me believe you'd be better off without me. I've been healthy for 12 years now. Therapy, medication, and hard work have given me back my life, but they can't give me back the years I lost with you. I understand if you can't forgive me. I understand if my leaving did too much damage for us to repair. But if there's even a small part of you that wants to know your mother, I'm here. I've been here all along, loving you, missing you, hoping that someday you'll come home." By the time Asha finished reading, both of them were crying. Tim sat stunned, his entire worldview shifting as 30 years of assumptions crumbled around him. "She never stopped loving me," he whispered. "No," Asha agreed, wiping tears from her cheeks. "She was just too sick to know how to show it." Tim looked at Asha through the moonlight, seeing his own pain and healing reflected in her face. "We're quite a pair, aren't we? Both so afraid of being abandoned that we've been abandoning ourselves." "What do we do about it?" she asked softly. Tim reached for her face, cupping her cheek in his palm. "We choose to stay. We choose to trust. We choose each other, despite the fear." When he kissed her this time, it was with everything he'd been holding back. Years of loneliness, decades of emotional starvation, a lifetime of believing he wasn't worth staying for. Asha responded with equal hunger, equal desperation, equal hope. They made love slowly, tenderly, by moonlight streaming through windows that faced the endless ocean. Tim paid special attention to her body, learning every curve, every sensitive spot. Every sound she made when he touched her just right. Asha's hands mapped his scars, emotional and physical, with reverent care, her kisses healing wounds he'd carried for decades. When they came together completely, it was with the knowledge that they were healing each other, choosing vulnerability over safety, love over fear. In the aftermath, wrapped in each other's arms with trade winds cooling their heated skin, Tim felt something he'd never experienced before, the bone-deep certainty of being exactly where he belonged. "I love you," he whispered against her hair. "I know it's too soon, I know it's crazy, but I love you." Asha lifted her head to look at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I love you too. God help us both, but I love you too." Outside, storm clouds that had been gathering all evening finally opened, releasing warm rain that drummed against the cottage roof. Inside, two people, who had spent years running from love, finally stopped long enough to let it catch them. Tim woke to sunlight streaming through unfamiliar windows and the sound of his phone buzzing insistently on the nightstand. Asha stirred beside him, her dark skin beautiful against white sheets, her face peaceful in sleep. For a moment, he allowed himself to simply watch her, marveling at how completely his life had changed in less than 48 hours. Then, reality crashed back. The phone showed 27 missed calls from Marcus Thompson and 3 from Isabella Montrose, his ex-fiancée who shouldn't even know he was in Barbados. Tim eased out of bed carefully, not wanting to wake Asha, and stepped onto the cottage's small veranda to return the calls. "Thank God." Marcus's voice was strained with relief and anger. "Tim, what the hell is going on? I've been calling for 18 hours straight. The Shangri-La people are furious. The acquisition paperwork is due at the tourism board in 3 hours, and Isabella says you've been posting pictures on social media that make you look like you're having some kind of breakdown." Tim frowned, pulling up his social media accounts. Sure enough, Asha had tagged him in photos from yesterday's tour, visiting the hotels, meeting the families, playing dominoes with David Allen. To someone who didn't understand the context, it might look like he'd lost focus on business priorities. "Marcus, I need to tell you something. You need to get to that tourism board meeting and complete those acquisitions, Marcus interrupted. The Shangri-La deal is worth $250 million, Tim, $250 million. Don't throw that away for some vacation romance. The casual dismissal of what Tim had experienced, the reduction of profound connection to vacation romance, sparked anger in his chest. It's not a vacation romance, Marcus. I'm in love with her. Silence on the other end of the line, then incredulous laughter. You're in love? Tin, you've known this woman for 2 days. You don't even know her last name. Greenidge. Asha Greenidge. And I know she's brilliant, kind, protective of her family, passionate about sustainable development, and has the most beautiful smile I've ever seen. I know she makes me want to be a better man than I've ever been. Oh, Christ. Marcus's voice turned serious. Tim, listen to me. You're having a midlife crisis. It happens to successful men all the time. But you can't throw away 8 years of work for some fantasy about tropical romance. Before Tim could respond, another call came through. Isabella Montrose, his ex-fiancée from New York. Tim had ended their engagement 6 months ago, when he'd realized he felt more affection for his accountant than for the woman he was supposed to marry. Isabella? How did you— Tim, darling, I saw the photos. You look absolutely lost. Her voice carried the precise diction of old New England money. I'm at the airport in San Juan. I'll be there in 2 hours to bring you home. What? Isabella, I didn't ask you to. Obviously you're not thinking clearly. Marcus called me, worried sick about this Shangri-La deal. Tim, we can work things out between us. The engagement was just pre-wedding nerves. But you can't throw away your entire future for some island fling. Tim's grip tightened on the phone. First Marcus dismissing Asha as vacation romance, now Isabella calling her an island fling. The casual racism and classism made his stomach turn. Isabella, what we had is over. I'm not having a breakdown, I'm not confused, and I'm not coming back to New York. Tim, be reasonable. You're talking about walking away from $250 million for a woman you just met. What's her angle? Is she after your money? Because island women are notorious for— Tim hung up before she could finish the sentence. His hands were shaking with rage at the implications, the assumptions, the casual bigotry that reduced Asha to a stereotype. Behind him, the cottage door opened softly. Asha emerged wearing one of his shirts, her hair tousled from sleep, carrying 2 cups of coffee. But her face was carefully neutral, and Tim realized she'd heard at least part of the conversation. Good morning, she said quietly, offering him a cup. Busy morning for phone calls. Asha, your business partner and ex-fiancé, I assume? Her voice was professionally polite, but Tim could see the walls going back up behind her eyes. They're concerned about your vacation romance? Tim set down the coffee and reached for her hands. They don't understand what this is. What you are to me. Don't I? Asha pulled her hands free gently. Tim, yesterday you were ready to throw away $250 million for community development and sustainable tourism. Today you have to face the reality of what that choice actually costs. The money doesn't matter. The money always matters, she interrupted, but not unkindly. Not because I want it, but because walking away from it changes everything about your life, your business, your partnerships, your family relationships, your identity. Are you really ready for that? Tim stared at her, seeing the fear beneath her calm exterior. She was giving him an out, protecting herself from another Clayton Webb situation by pushing him toward the practical choice. You think I'm going to change my mind, he said quietly. I think you're a good man who got caught up in an emotional moment, Asha replied carefully. I think when you see your ex-fiancé, when you remember your real life, when you calculate what this decision actually costs, you'll realize that some sacrifices are too big to make for someone you've known for 2 days. The pain in her voice nearly broke his heart. She was already bracing for abandonment, already protecting herself from the hurt she believed was inevitable. And if I prove you wrong? Tim asked softly. If I walk into that tourism board meeting in 2 hours and withdraw my applications? If I tell Shangri-La to find another partner? If I choose you, choose this community, choose a completely different life? For a moment, hope flickered in her eyes. Then the professional mask slipped back into place. Then I guess we'll see what happens next. Tim's phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. Isabella lands at 11 a.m. Tourism board meeting at 10 a.m. Fix this, Tim. Don't throw your life away. Looking at the message, then at Ash's carefully guarded expression, Tim realized he was standing at the most important crossroads of his life. Behind him lay everything he'd worked for, everything that had defined his worth for 39 years. Ahead lay uncertainty, love, and the possibility of becoming someone entirely different. The tourism board meeting would start in exactly 2 hours and 15 minutes. By noon, he would either be the same man who had arrived in Barbados 3 days ago, or he would be someone completely new. Either way, there was no going back. Wednesday morning arrived gray and humid. The tourism board offices buzzed with nervous energy at 9:30, just 30 minutes before the 10 a.m. meeting that would decide the fate of 6 families and Tim's $250 million future. Tim arrived wearing his most expensive suit, carrying the briefcase that had started everything, looking every inch the successful international developer the community feared he was. But inside, his heart hammered against his ribs as he watched 6 families file into the small conference room, their faces showing dignified resignation mixed with desperate hope. Asha sat in the front row with Winston, her professional demeanor firmly in place, but Tim caught the way her hands trembled slightly as she arranged her papers. She dressed carefully in a navy blazer and skirt that emphasized her expertise while honoring her cultural heritage through the traditional silver bangles on her wrists, her grandmother's, Tim realized. Worn for strength, just like the pearl earrings. The room felt heavy with unspoken prayers. Margaret Allen clutched David's hand so tightly her knuckles showed white. Samuel Clark sat with his wife Bernice, both of them staring straight ahead with the stoic dignity of people who'd survived disappointment before. The Johnson family huddled together, 3 generations whose entire legacy hung in the balance of what Tim would say in the next hour. Mr. Garland, Grace Allen, Margaret's sister and the community's lawyer, approached with a folder thick with documentation. I have the community impact assessments you requested. 6 hotels, 47 employees, 12 local suppliers, and an estimated 230 community members who depend directly or indirectly on tourism income from these properties. Tim accepted the folder, his hand steady despite the chaos in his chest. Behind the cold statistics were faces he now knew. Miss Catherine, who cleaned rooms at Seabreeze and sent money to her daughter in university in Canada. The Dennison couple who'd worked at Winston's Hotel for 15 years while saving for their own place. Miguel Santos, who'd spent 30 years at Blue Waters Lodge teaching visitors about Bajan fishing traditions. Thank you, Miss Allen. I've reviewed all the materials, Tim replied, his voice carrying none of the uncertainty churning in his gut. At the back of the room, he spotted 2 figures that made his blood run cold. Marcus Thompson had arrived on the early morning flight, his expensive suit wrinkled from travel, his face set in lines of barely controlled fury. Beside him sat Isabella Montrose, his ex-fiancée, her platinum blonde hair perfectly styled despite the Caribbean humidity, her pale blue eyes calculating as they assessed the situation with the cold precision of old New England money. Tim's phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. Contracts ready, Shangri-La, lawyers standing by, don't blow this. Another message followed immediately. Isabella's here to help you remember who you really are. At exactly 10 o'clock, Tourism Board Chairman Harold Prescott called the meeting to order. A distinguished man in his 60s with silver hair and kind eyes, he'd built his reputation on fair dealing and community protection over 20 years of managing Barbados. Delicate balance between tourism revenue and cultural preservation. This morning we review 6 acquisition applications from Garland International Development, along with community responses to proposed changes in property ownership and usage. Chairman Prescott's voice carried the authority of someone who'd seen too many communities destroyed by poorly planned development. We have 47 jobs, 6 family businesses, and significant cultural heritage at stake. Mr. Garland, please present your development plans. Tim stood slowly, aware that every eye in the room was on him. The weight of 47 livelihoods, 6 family legacies, and 1 woman's trust pressed down on his shoulders like a physical force. Through the windows, he could see Bridgetown Harbor, where cargo ships unloaded goods that would stock the very hotels he was planning to eliminate. Chairman Prescott, honorable board members, respected community representatives. Tim began, his voice carrying easily through the small room despite the tremor in his chest. 3 days ago, I came to Barbados with one goal: to acquire 6 properties for luxury resort development as part of a partnership with Shangri-La Hotels International. Murmurs rippled through the families. Tim saw David Alleyne grip his mother's hand tighter, his face showing the confusion of someone who understood that his job was in jeopardy, but didn't fully comprehend the larger economic forces at play. Samuel Clark closed his eyes briefly, as if preparing for bad news, while his wife Bernice reached for his hand in silent support. I had researched the financial value of these properties, their strategic location, their potential for maximizing return on investment, Tim continued, his businessman's vocabulary feeling foreign and sharp in this room full of people whose lives he was about to dissect. Market analysis indicated that consolidating these 6 properties under corporate management would increase revenue potential by 300% within 18 months. The Johnson family exchanged glances, heavy with the weight of generational fear. Their great-grandfather had been born into slavery on a nearby plantation, had worked 40 years as a fisherman to buy this land 1 acre at a time, driven by the conviction that once you owned land, nobody could make you move again. Now his great-great-grandchildren sat listening to a wealthy white developer explain why their legacy was inefficient. What I had not researched, Tim said, his voice growing stronger as he found his footing, what no market analysis could have told me, was the human value of what I planned to destroy. He paused, letting his eyes sweep across the room, taking in faces that had become dear to him in ways he'd never expected. Winston Greenidge sat with the quiet dignity of a man who'd built something lasting with his own hands, who'd weathered hurricanes both literal and metaphorical, who'd raised his granddaughter to be strong enough to challenge men like Tim while remaining open enough to love them. These contracts, Tim said, opening his briefcase and pulling out the acquisition documents, thick legal papers representing millions of dollars in transactions, would have made me very wealthy. They would have eliminated what some might consider inefficient use of prime real estate. They would have replaced family-owned hospitality with corporate management, authentic cultural experiences with manufactured entertainment, community employment with imported labor. He looked directly at Asha, seeing hope and terror warring in her dark eyes, remembering the way she tested him with wrong directions and incomplete information, protecting her community the only way she knew how. They would also have displaced 6 families who have built something infinitely more valuable than a luxury resort. They have built community. Marcus shifted nervously in his seat, his phone already out, probably texting urgent messages to the Shangri-La lawyers waiting in their Bridgetown offices. Isabella's expression hardened with the realization that Tim wasn't performing temporary insanity. He was making a calculated choice that threatened everything they understood about his character and their shared future. Chairman Prescott, Tim continued, his voice growing stronger with each word, I formally withdraw all 6 acquisition applications. These properties should remain in the hands of the families who have stewarded them with such care, who have created authentic experiences that money cannot replicate, who have built businesses that serve their community, rather than merely extracting profit from it. The room erupted. Margaret Allen burst into tears of relief, her hand flying to her mouth as if to contain sobs of gratitude. David whooped with joy before his mother shushed him gently, her own face bright with amazement. The Johnson family embraced each other, 3 generations holding tight to the confirmation that their legacy would survive another generation. Patricia Thornfield covered her face with her hands, shoulders shaking with the release of months of accumulated stress about George's medical bills and their hotel's uncertain future. But Tim wasn't finished. Furthermore, he said, raising his voice over the celebration, I would like to propose an alternative development model. Instead of acquisition and replacement, I propose partnership and enhancement. The room quieted, everyone straining to hear what came next, afraid to believe that good news might actually continue to unfold. I'm establishing the Barbados Community Tourism Development Fund with an initial investment of $50 million, Tim announced. his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd made billion-dollar decisions before, but never one that felt as important as this. This fund will provide low-interest loans for property improvements, grants for cultural preservation projects, startup capital for community-based tourism initiatives, and educational scholarships for young people who want to build careers in sustainable hospitality management. Winston Greenidge stood slowly, his weathered face showing an amazement that made him look decades younger. "Mr. Garland, are you saying—" "I'm saying that the 6 hotels will serve as anchor properties in a sustainable tourism network that keeps ownership local while providing world-class visitor experiences," Tim replied, his eyes never leaving Asha's face. "I'm saying that profit and community benefit don't have to be mutually exclusive. I'm saying that some things are worth more than money. I'm saying that I've found something here in Barbados that I've been searching for my entire life, a place where I belong." The silence that followed was profound, heavy with the weight of lives that had just been transformed. Then Margaret Allen stood up, her voice shaking with emotion. "Mr. Garland, you don't understand what you've just done," she said, tears streaming down her cheeks. "David's job, our hotel, my son's medical care. You've saved everything that matters to us." Samuel Clark struggled to his feet, his walking stick trembling in his grip. "Sir, my medication, my wife's diabetes treatments, our cultural programs, we thought it was all ending today. You've given us our future back." One by one, the other families stood, each sharing what Tim's decision meant. Maya's college education secured, the Johnson family's legacy preserved, Patricia and George's medical bills manageable, Joyce and Michael's community partnerships protected. Marcus Thompson shot to his feet, his face red with fury and disbelief. "Tim, you can't be serious. The Shangri-La deal, $250 million. You're throwing away $250 million for what? For these people? For this woman?" The dismissive gesture Marcus made toward Asha, the casual racism implicit in "these people," sent cold fury through Tim's chest. "I'm throwing away $250 million for love," Tim said simply, his voice carrying a finality that silenced all objections. "For community, for the chance to build something that matters more than my bank balance, for the opportunity to be judged by what I preserve rather than what I acquire." "You're having a breakdown," Isabella said, standing as well, her voice carrying the sharp edge of old money disapproval mixed with genuine concern. "Tim, this isn't you. You're disciplined, rational, profit-focused. Come home with me. We can work through this together. The engagement was just pre-wedding nerves, we both know that." Tim looked at Isabella, beautiful, accomplished. Socially appropriate Isabella, who understood his background and shared his language, but had never once made his heart race or his priorities shift. "Isabella, what we had was never love," he said gently but firmly. "It was convenience, social compatibility, shared backgrounds, mutual benefit. But it wasn't love. I know that now because I know what love actually feels like." He turned to face Asha directly, speaking to her across the room full of people whose entire futures had just changed, whose children could now plan for college, whose elderly parents could age with dignity, whose cultural traditions would survive another generation. "Love feels like coming home to a place you've never been," Tim said, his voice carrying clearly through the suddenly quiet room. "Love feels like someone seeing past your defenses to the person you could become. Love feels like being willing to give up everything you thought you wanted for someone who makes you want to be worthy of their faith. Love feels like finding a community that accepts you, not for what you own, but for who you choose to be." Asha's composure finally cracked. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she stood and walked toward him, the entire room watching their private moment play out in public, witnessing the kind of love story that becomes legend. "Are you sure?" she whispered when she reached him, her voice barely audible above the sound of her grandfather's quiet weeping and David Allen's continued excited whispers to his mother. "Are you absolutely certain? Because if you're not, if there's even a small part of you that might regret this." Tim cupped her face in his hands, thumbs wiping away her tears, his voice steady with absolute conviction. "Asha, I have never been more certain of anything in my life. I love you. I love this community. I love the man I become when I'm with you. I love the fact that your grandfather makes me feel like family. That David trusts me with his future. That Samuel and Bernice teach me about preserving culture while building prosperity. Whatever comes next, we'll face it together." When he kissed her, the room exploded in applause and cheers. David Allen whistled appreciatively. Winston wiped tears from his eyes with hands that had built the hotel where his granddaughter had just found her future. Even Chairman Prescott smiled broadly as he reached for his gavel. "Motion to approve the Barbados Community Tourism Development Fund proposal," the chairman announced, his voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who'd just witnessed the best possible outcome for his community. "All in favor." The vote was unanimous. Marcus stormed out, his phone already pressed to his ear, probably calling lawyers to determine his options for dissolving the partnership Tim had just destroyed. Isabella lingered for a moment, her calculating gaze taking in Tim's transformation with something that might have been genuine sadness for the life they'd never really wanted together. "I hope you know what you're doing," she said quietly before following Marcus toward the exit. "I do," Tim replied, his arms still around Asha. "For the first time in my life, I absolutely do." The celebration that followed the tourism board meeting was unlike anything Tim had ever experienced. What had started as a formal government proceeding transformed into an impromptu community festival, as word spread through the island's efficient, informal network that the 6 hotels had been saved, that 47 jobs were secure, that a development fund would create opportunities for an entire generation of young Bajans. Steel drum players appeared from nowhere, filling the government parking lot with music that seemed to embody the joy of survival and hope. Margaret Allen's sister Grace had called her husband, who'd called his nephew, who'd brought his food truck. Within an hour, the serious business of cultural preservation had become a block party celebrating community resilience. Tim found himself at the center of it all, still wearing his expensive suit, but with his tie loosened and his sleeves rolled up, learning to play dominoes with David Allen while elderly men offered advice, and women shared plates of traditional food that appeared with Caribbean magic. "Mr. Tim," David called out enthusiastically as he won another hand. "You're getting better. Maybe in a year you'll be good enough to beat me." "A year," Tim laughed, the sound coming easier than it had in decades. "David, I'm planning to be here a lot longer than a year." The words carried more weight than casual conversation. Around the domino table, men who'd spent their lives reading subtle cues in everything from weather patterns to tourist preferences exchanged meaningful glances. Kim Garland wasn't just staying for a development project. He was staying for good. Samuel Clark, his walking stick propped against his chair as he studied his dominoes with the intensity of a chess master, looked up with eyes that had seen 70 years of change on the island. "Mr. Garland, what will you do about your business in the United States? Your properties, your partnerships, your life there?" The question Tim had been avoiding all morning, the practical implications of turning his back on everything he built over 8 years of relentless focus. Marcus was right about one thing. Walking away from the Shangri-La deal meant more than losing money. It meant dissolving partnerships, liquidating assets, fundamentally restructuring his entire professional identity. "I'll figure it out," Tim said, realizing as he spoke that for the first time in his adult life, he was making a major decision without a detailed financial plan. Something far more important than efficiency. "Ah," Winston's voice carried the satisfaction of someone whose guidance had been validated. "Now you're learning." Across the parking lot, Asha moved through the crowd with the natural grace of someone who belonged everywhere she went, checking on elderly guests who might be overwhelmed by the noise, making sure children weren't getting into trouble near the food trucks, coordinating with Grace Allen to ensure the families understood the legal paperwork for the development fund. Tim watched her work. No longer the hotel receptionist who'd tested him with wrong directions, but the brilliant hospitality manager who'd once run the Hilton Barbados at 28, quit to protect her community from another Clayton Webb, who'd spent 4 years building the expertise to prevent exactly the kind of cultural displacement Tim had originally planned. "She's remarkable," he said aloud, not really meaning to voice the thought. "She is," Winston agreed, following Tim's gaze. "But so are you, son. Takes a remarkable man to see past his own plans to something better." The afternoon stretched into evening as the impromptu celebration gained momentum. Musicians arrived with steel drums and guitars, transforming the government parking lot into an outdoor concert venue. Children ran between tables while teenagers helped serve food, and elderly couples danced to music that celebrated survival, community, and the kind of love that changes everything. Tim's phone buzzed constantly, Marcus calling with increasingly urgent demands for explanations, Isabella texting about flights back to New York, lawyers requesting clarification about partnership dissolutions and contract cancellations. But for the first time in his adult life, Tim ignored business calls in favor of learning to dance merengue from Joyce Baptiste's teenage daughter, Mr. Garland. A voice interrupted his concentration on not stepping on his dance partner's feet. He turned to find a young woman about Maya's age, her notebook and past credentials identifying her as a reporter from the Barbados Advocate. "Jennifer Marshall, local news," she introduced herself. "Could I ask you a few questions about the development fund? This is a pretty unusual business model for international developers." Tim glanced around the celebration. David Allain teaching tourist children to play dominoes. Margaret Allain showing visitors how to prepare traditional flying fish. The Johnson family sharing stories about their great-grandfather's journey from slavery to land ownership. "Miss Marshall, nothing about this community is usual. Why should the business model be any different? But you're giving up significant profit for what exactly? Goodwill? Tax benefits? Long-term investment strategy?" The reporter's questions reflected exactly the kind of thinking Tim had brought to Barbados 3 days ago, reducing every human interaction to financial motivation, every relationship to potential return on investment. "I'm giving up profit for purpose," Tim said simply, "for belonging to something bigger than my bank account, for the privilege of being trusted by people like Winston Greenidge, who built this community with his own hands, and Asha Greenidge, who's dedicated her life to protecting it." Jennifer scribbled notes, clearly struggling to fit Tim's answers into standard business journalism categories. "And your partnership with Shangri-La Hotels? Sources say this decision cost you over $200 million. "Sources are correct," Tim confirmed. "Best money I never made." As if summoned by the mention of his name, Marcus Thompson appeared at Tim's shoulder, his face flushed with heat and frustration, his expensive clothes wilted by Caribbean humidity and the stress of watching 8 years of partnership dissolve in a single morning. "Tim, we need to talk. Now." Marcus's voice carried the barely controlled fury of someone whose careful plans had been destroyed by what he perceived as emotional weakness. "Do you have any idea what you've done? The Shangri-La lawyers are threatening breach of contract lawsuits. Our other development projects are in jeopardy. 8 years of work, gone because you fell for some island woman." The casual racism, the dismissive tone, the reduction of profound transformation to falling for some island woman, it all crystallized Tim's understanding of who he'd been and who he was choosing to become. "Marcus," Tim said calmly, "our partnership is dissolved. I'll buy out your share of our existing properties at fair market value, but I won't be working with you anymore." "You can't just— This isn't how business works, Tim. You have obligations, contracts, responsibilities." "I have exactly one responsibility," Tim interrupted, his voice carrying new authority that came from absolute certainty about his priorities. "To live with integrity. To build something that matters. To be worthy of the trust these people have placed in me." Marcus's face went white with shock at Tim's casual dismissal of everything they'd built together. "This is insane. You're throwing away your entire career. For what? A vacation romance? Some fantasy about tropical paradise?" Before Tim could respond, Winston Greenidge appeared beside him, his presence carrying the quiet dignity of someone who'd weathered 78 years of challenges with grace and wisdom. "Mr. Thompson," Winston said politely, "I don't believe we've been properly introduced. Winston Greenidge, Asha's grandfather, owner of Seabreeze Guesthouse." He extended his weathered hand with the courtesy that had made him a legendary host for 6 decades. Marcus ignored the offered handshake, his attention focused entirely on Tim. "Think about what you're doing. Think about your future. Your reputation, your financial security. This isn't you, Tim. You don't make emotional decisions." "You're right," Tim agreed. "The old Tim didn't make emotional decisions. The old Tim was terrified of attachment, afraid of staying anywhere too long, convinced that accumulating wealth was the only way to prove his worth. But that Tim was miserable, Marcus. Successful and miserable, he gestured toward the celebration surrounding them, families sharing food and music, children playing between tables, elderly couples dancing to steel drum music, teenagers teaching visitors traditional crafts. This Tim is happy. This Tim belongs somewhere. This Tim is building something that will outlast his bank balance. And when it falls apart, Marcus demanded, when the romance wears off and you realize you've given up everything for a woman you barely know and a community that will never really accept you, what then? The question hung in the air like a challenge, exposing the fear that Tim had been carrying since his mother's abandonment 30 years ago. The terror of investing everything in people who might leave, places that might reject him, love that might prove temporary. Winston's voice, when he spoke, carried the authority of someone who'd seen generations of love stories, who'd weathered his own losses and learned the difference between love that endures and attraction that fades. Mr. Thompson, he said gently, love that's built on shared values, mutual respect, and commitment to something bigger than ourselves doesn't wear off. It deepens. It grows stronger through challenges, not weaker. And as for acceptance, he gestured toward the crowd, where Tim was clearly being treated as family rather than visitor. That's not something you earn through money or credentials. That's something you earn through character. Marcus shook his head in disgust. Fine, destroy your life for people who will forget about you the moment the development fund money runs out. But don't expect me to stand by and watch. He stormed away, already pulling out his phone to begin the complex process of extracting himself from their partnership and salvaging what he could from the wreckage of Tim's emotional breakdown. Tim watched him go with a mixture of sadness and relief. Marcus had been a good business partner, intelligent, driven, focused on results. But he'd never been a friend, never been someone Tim could trust with vulnerability. Never been someone who cared about Tim's happiness more than his productivity. You all right, son? Winston asked quietly. Better than all right, Tim replied, and realized it was completely true. For the first time in my life, I'm exactly where I belong. Now, my Royal Story family, I'm curious. What's the most transformative decision you've ever made for love? Let's celebrate the power of love together. As the evening celebration gradually wound down and families began heading home, Tim found himself helping Winston and Asha clean up the impromptu festival that had transformed a government parking lot into a community gathering space. It struck him as profoundly symbolic, taking responsibility for the aftermath of joy, caring for the practical details that allowed celebration to happen safely. Tomorrow we start the real work, Asha said as they folded tables and packed leftover food into containers that would feed families for days. Establishing the development fund, creating loan application processes, setting up partnerships with existing tourism organizations, developing the infrastructure to support sustainable growth. Tim smiled at her easy transition from celebration to planning, the way her mind immediately moved to implementation and long-term success. This was the woman who'd built a career in hospitality management before she was 30, who'd walked away from it to protect her community, who'd spent 4 years developing the expertise to prevent exactly what Tim had originally planned. I'll need to liquidate my U.S. assets to fund the initial investment, he said, already running through the logistics. Sell the Manhattan condo, the Hampton house, dissolve the other development partnerships, close the Connecticut office. That's a big change, Asha observed carefully. Are you sure you're ready to burn all those bridges? They're not bridges, Tim replied, understanding something about himself that had taken 39 years to recognize. They're anchors. They've been keeping me tied to a life that never made me happy, never gave me purpose, never felt like home. Winston, loading the last of the folding chairs into a borrowed pickup truck, paused to study Tim's face in the parking lot's fluorescent lighting. Son, what exactly are you planning to do here? Besides the development fund, I mean, what will your life look like? It was a fair question, and one Tim hadn't fully considered beyond his absolute certainty that his life was now inextricably linked to this place, these people. This woman who'd challenged everything he thought he knew about success. I want to learn sustainable tourism development from the ground up, Tim said slowly, the plan forming as he spoke. Not as an outsider imposing ideas, but as someone who understands both the capital requirements and the community needs. I want to help create a model that can be replicated throughout the Caribbean, tourism that strengthens local communities instead of displacing them. Asha's eyes lit up with professional excitement. A hybrid approach, international capital and local expertise, market rate returns and community benefit, scalable models and cultural authenticity. Exactly, and I want to learn from the best. Tim looked directly at her, love and admiration clear in his expression. I want to partner with someone who's already proven that sustainable tourism isn't just idealistic theory, it's profitable practice. You're asking me to be your business partner? Asha asked, her voice carrying wonder and cautious hope. I'm asking you to teach me how to be worthy of your community's trust, Tim replied. I'm asking you to help me build something that honors what your grandfather created while expanding opportunities for the next generation. I'm asking you to believe that I can be more than just another Clayton Webb with better intentions. The reference to her ex-boyfriend, the developer who'd used her local knowledge and family connections to betray the community's trust, hung between them like a test. Tim was deliberately invoking her deepest fear about wealthy developers, acknowledging the pattern she was afraid he might repeat. Clayton made promises about community benefit, Asha said quietly. He talked about cultural preservation and local employment, right up until the bulldozers arrived to clear land for luxury condos. I know, Tim acknowledged, and you have every reason to be skeptical. But Clayton's promises were words. Let me show you with actions. Let me prove over time, through choices and consequences, that some people can change. Winston, who'd been listening to their conversation with the patient attention of someone who'd learned to evaluate character through observation rather than proclamation, cleared his throat meaningfully. Asha, child, there's something you need to understand about trust, he said gently. You can't protect yourself from being hurt again by refusing to trust anyone. All that does is guarantee you'll be lonely. Sometimes you have to take the risk of believing in someone, even if they might disappoint you. And if I'm wrong? Asha asked, vulnerability clear in her voice. If I trust him, and he turns out to be just another developer who talks a good game until the profits don't meet expectations, then you'll survive, Winston replied, with the authority of someone who'd weathered genuine loss. Your grandmother and I trusted the wrong people more than once. Lost money, lost opportunities, had our hearts broken by friends who didn't deserve our faith. But we also found each other, built this place, raised your mother and then you, created something lasting. You can't build anything meaningful without risking disappointment. Tim reached for Asha's hand, intertwining their fingers while they stood in the empty parking lot where hours earlier they'd both chosen to trust in something bigger than their individual fears. I can't promise I'll never make mistakes, he said honestly. I can't promise that every business decision will prioritize community benefit over profit, or that I'll always understand the cultural implications of development choices. But I can promise that I'll listen to you, learn from you, and put this community's long-term interests ahead of my short-term gains. And if I hold you to that, if I challenge every decision, question every choice, make sure you understand the real cost of every project. Tim smiled, remembering the woman who'd tested him with wrong directions and incomplete information, who'd spent their first conversation cataloging his previous acquisitions and their human impact. Asha, I'm counting on it. For a long moment, they stood together in the warm Caribbean night, surrounded by the lingering echoes of celebration and the weight of decisions that would reshape multiple futures. Then Asha rose on her toes and kissed him, soft and sweet and full of the promise of partnership that extended far beyond romance. In that case, she whispered against his lips, we should probably start planning our first project. 6 months later, the Barbados Community Tourism Development Fund offices buzzed with the kind of productive energy that comes from success exceeding everyone's most optimistic projections. Tim, wearing a guayabera, that Asha had insisted was more appropriate than his old business suits for Caribbean professional life, reviewed quarterly reports that told a story of transformation beyond what anyone had imagined possible. The Clark's Cultural Center is booked solid through next year, Maya Greenidge reported, her MIT engineering education perfectly suited to analyzing tourism data and economic impact. Average visitor spending per day has increased 40%, and guest satisfaction scores are the highest in the Caribbean. Tim looked across the conference table at his wife, still a thrilling word after 4 months of marriage, noting how pregnancy had added a glow to her already radiant beauty. Asha was 6 months along with their first child, a daughter they planned to name Grace, after the community lawyer who'd helped facilitate the development fund. The Johnson family's fishing experiences are generating waiting lists, Asha added, her professional competence seamlessly adapted to running the fund's day-to-day operations. They've trained 2 additional boats and crews to meet demand, and young Marcus is developing an advanced program for serious fishing enthusiasts. David Alleyne, now the fund's community liaison coordinator, beamed with pride as he delivered his report. Medical tourism at Palm Court Hotel has expanded to include wellness retreats and recovery programs. Mrs. Sarist Margaret has hired 2 additional nurses and is planning a specialized wing for extended stay patients. The transformation had exceeded every projection. What had started as a desperate attempt to save 6 family businesses had become a model for sustainable tourism development that was being studied by economists throughout the Caribbean. The World Bank had sent a team to document their methods, and 3 other islands had requested consultations about implementing similar programs. The best part, Winston said from his position as the fund's cultural advisor, is that our young people are staying home. Maya's engineering consultancy, Marcus's fishing business, David's hospitality innovations, they're building careers here instead of emigrating to find opportunities. Tim felt the deep satisfaction that came from success, measured in more than financial returns. Yes, the fund was profitable, generating returns that attracted additional investment from socially conscious developers throughout the region. But more importantly, it was creating the kind of community stability that allowed families to plan for generations rather than just surviving from season to season. Speaking of young people staying home, Asha said with a meaningful look at Tim, we need to discuss the expansion proposal. Tim opened the folder she placed in front of him, revealing detailed plans for scaling their model throughout the Eastern Caribbean. Antigua, Dominica, St. Lucia, and Grenada had all submitted formal requests for development fund partnerships, complete with community assessments and business plans developed by local families who'd studied the Barbados model. $50 million expansion, Tim read aloud, automatically calculating the financial implications. 40 communities, 200 small businesses, estimated 1,200 jobs created or preserved. Conservative estimates, Maya added. Based on our Barbados results, the actual impact could be significantly higher. Tim studied the numbers. Remembering the man who'd arrived in Barbados 8 months ago, focused entirely on individual profit maximization. That man would have calculated return on investment, market share, competitive advantages. This man found himself thinking about families who would be able to stay together, young people who could build careers in their home communities, cultural traditions that would be preserved through economic viability. What's our biggest challenge? He asked. Finding investors who understand that sustainable returns are more valuable than maximum returns, Asha replied. Most development capital still focuses on short-term profit extraction rather than long-term community building. And our biggest opportunity? Proving that community-focused tourism consistently outperforms resort-based tourism in visitor satisfaction, repeat business, and long-term profitability. Maya answered with the confidence of someone who'd run the numbers multiple times. Authentic experiences command premium prices precisely because they can't be manufactured or mass-produced. Tim's phone rang, a call from his father in Connecticut, probably checking on the progress of the foundation that had redirected the Garland maritime shipping fortune toward sustainable development throughout the Caribbean. The relationship they'd rebuilt over the past 6 months was still tentative, but Tim's half-siblings had become enthusiastic supporters of the fund, especially after visiting Barbados and seeing the results firsthand. "Dad," Tim answered warmly, noting how natural the word felt after 30 years of formal distance. "How are the Connecticut projects progressing?" "Better than expected." His father's voice carried genuine pride, mixed with amazement at his oldest son's transformation. "The New Bedford Fishing Community Partnership is ahead of schedule, and the Martha's Vineyard Cultural Preservation Fund has attracted matching grants from the State Tourism Board." The conversation that followed was about family business in the best sense: shared values, community impact, legacy planning that extended beyond individual wealth accumulation. Tim's father had initially been skeptical of his son's tropical idealism, but 6 months of impressive financial returns, combined with meaningful social impact, had converted the elder Garland into an enthusiastic advocate for sustainable development. After the call ended, Tim found himself looking around the conference table at the faces that had become his true family. Asha, whose brilliant expertise had taught him the difference between developing communities and extracting profit from them. Winston, whose gentle wisdom had shown him what committed love looked like. Maya, whose youthful energy reminded him that building something meaningful required thinking in generations rather than quarters. David, whose authentic enthusiasm proved that success should be measured by how many people benefit rather than how much money accumulates. "So," he said, closing the expansion proposal folder, "when do we start?" The celebration that followed was characteristically Caribbean, spontaneous, joyful, and inclusive. Within an hour, word had spread through the community that the development fund was expanding throughout the region, that Barbados' success story would be replicated in dozens of other communities, that sustainable tourism had proven itself as both profitable business and effective social policy. Steel drum players appeared from nowhere, transforming the business meeting into an impromptu festival in the development fund offices. Margaret Alleyne arrived with traditional wedding cake left over from a weekend celebration, while the Johnson family brought fresh fish and the expertise to prepare it for an unexpected feast. Tim found himself once again at the center of a community celebration. But this time, there was no awkwardness, no sense of being an outsider looking in. This was his family, his community, his life in every sense that mattered. "Happy?" Asha asked, appearing at his elbow with a plate of flying fish and the kind of smile that still made his heart race even after months of marriage. "Completely," Tim replied, his hand moving automatically to rest on her growing belly, where their daughter was already responding to steel drum music with enthusiastic kicks. "Have I mentioned lately that marrying you was the best decision I ever made?" "Not since this morning," Asha laughed, leaning into him with the comfortable affection of two people who'd chosen each other completely and never looked back. "But I never get tired of hearing it." As the celebration continued around them, families sharing food and music, children playing between tables, while teenagers helped serve guests, elderly couples dancing to rhythms that had been part of Caribbean culture for centuries, Tim marveled at the journey that had brought him here. 18 months ago, he'd been running through airports, chasing money, building walls around his heart. Now he was exactly where he belonged, with exactly the people he was meant to love, building exactly the legacy that would outlast his lifetime. "No regrets?" Asha asked, the question that had become their private ritual, their way of checking in with each other about the magnitude of the choices they'd made. "Only one," Tim replied, the answer that had become as automatic as breathing. "That I wasted 39 years not knowing you existed." Outside the office windows, the sun was setting over Bridgetown Harbor, painting the sky in shades of gold and coral that reminded Tim of their first morning together, when he'd watched sunrise from her cottage bed and realized his life would never be the same. Tomorrow would bring new challenges: expansion planning, investor meetings, the complex logistics of scaling community-based tourism throughout the Caribbean. But tonight was for celebration, for family, for the kind of joy that comes from building something meaningful with people who matter. As steel drum music filled the evening air and 3 generations danced together in an office that had become a community center, Tim felt the deep satisfaction that comes from a life well lived, love well chosen, and purpose well served. This was what success actually looked like. Not money in the bank or achievements on a resume, but the faces of people whose lives were better because you existed. The sound of children who would grow up in communities their parents had helped preserve. The warmth of belonging to something bigger and more important than individual ambition. Tim pulled Asha closer, feeling their daughter kick against his hand, as if already eager to join the celebration, and smiled at the perfect symmetry of it all. How love had led him to community, how community had taught him about purpose, how purpose had shown him what it meant to build a legacy worth leaving. Do you believe that finding the right person can completely change your understanding of what matters most? 2 years later, Tim stood in the Seabreeze guesthouse garden, watching his 18-month-old daughter, Grace, take her first wobbly steps toward her great-grandfather, Winston, who waited with arms outstretched and eyes bright with the kind of joy that comes from seeing family traditions continue across generations. The same garden where Winston had proposed to his wife 60 years ago, where Tim had learned what it meant to belong somewhere, where dozens of other love stories had begun and flourished, now witnessed another milestone in the continuing story of family, community, and the kind of love that builds something lasting. "There she goes," Asha said softly, her hand resting on her growing belly where their second child, a son they planned to name Winston, was already making his presence known with energetic kicks. "She's got your determination and my stubbornness." Tim laughed, watching Grace collapse into Winston's arms with delighted giggles, then immediately stand up to try the walk again. Around the garden, 3 generations of family gathered for their weekly Sunday dinner, a tradition that had grown to include not just blood relations, but the extended community family that had embraced Tim so completely that he sometimes forgot he'd ever lived anywhere else. "Mr. Tim," David Alleyne called out from the kitchen where he was helping prepare the evening feast, his role as the Development Fund's community coordinator having grown into something approaching family management. "The fish is ready. Should I ring the dinner bell?" "Let Grace finish her walking practice," Tim called back, still marveling at how completely his life had been transformed. The man who'd once lived out of a single suitcase, never staying anywhere longer than 6 months, now owned more roots than possessions. A cottage on the beach, a vegetable garden tended with Winston's guidance, a workshop where he was learning traditional carpentry techniques, and most importantly, a place in a community that measured wealth by relationships rather than bank balances. A development fund had exceeded every projection, expanding to 12 Caribbean islands and creating opportunities for thousands of families to build sustainable businesses that honored their cultural heritage while providing modern prosperity. Tim's role had evolved from foreign investor to community development specialist, his expertise now sought by organizations throughout the developing world who wanted to replicate the Barbados model. But the real measure of success wasn't in the financial reports or international recognition. It was in moments like this, watching his daughter learn to walk in the same garden where her mother had learned to trust again, where her great-grandfather had learned that love could span generations, where her father had learned that home was something you chose to build rather than something you were born into. "She's beautiful," a familiar voice said behind him. Tim turned to see his mother, Elizabeth, who'd flown down from Connecticut for Grace's first birthday celebration, and decided to extend her visit indefinitely. The relationship they'd rebuilt over the past 2 years was still careful, still healing, but rooted in genuine affection and mutual forgiveness that had grown stronger with time. "She is," Tim agreed, watching Grace toddle between family members who celebrated each wobbly step as if she'd just conquered Mount Everest. "She's got Asha's intelligence and Winston's charm. And your heart," Elizabeth added quietly. "The heart I was too sick to nurture when you were her age, but that somehow learned to love anyway." Tim reached for his mother's hand, a gesture that had become natural after years of careful rebuilding. "You taught me more than you know, Mom. You taught me that love is worth waiting for, that people can heal from broken places, that family isn't about perfection. It's about choosing each other despite the imperfections." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Maya and Marcus Johnson, the MIT engineer and traditional fisherman whose marriage had become another community success story. Their 3-month-old son slept peacefully in Maya's arms, while Marcus carried a cooler full of the day's catch that would become part of the evening feast. "How's the newest addition to the family?" Asha asked, moving carefully in her 7th month of pregnancy to admire the sleeping baby. "Perfect," Maya replied with the exhausted satisfaction of new motherhood. Just like his father, sleeps all day and wants to fish all night. The easy laughter that followed spoke to the comfort of family relationships that had deepened from business partnerships into genuine kinship. Tim looked around the garden at faces that had become central to his happiness, and realized that this was the legacy he wanted to leave. Not buildings or bank accounts, but relationships that would outlast his lifetime, communities that would thrive because of choices he'd made to invest in people rather than accumulate possessions. "Dinner," David's voice carried clearly across the garden, and the family migration toward the sea breeze dining room began with the comfortable chaos of multiple generations, sharing a meal that had been prepared with love, seasoned with tradition, and served with the kind of hospitality that Winston Greenidge had perfected over 60 years of welcoming strangers as family. As they settled around tables that had been expanded to accommodate the growing community family, Tim felt the deep satisfaction that comes from building something meaningful with people who matter. Grace babbled happily in her high chair, alternately feeding herself and offering bites to anyone within reach, while Winston regaled the table with stories about her latest accomplishments that made it clear his great-granddaughter was obviously the most remarkable child ever born. "She said Grandpa win yesterday," Winston announced proudly to the assembled family. "Clear as day, sitting in her playpen, looking right at me, Grandpa win." "That's wonderful," Margaret Allain said warmly, her son David nodding enthusiastically as he helped serve the evening meal. David's first word was cookie, which tells you everything about his priorities. The gentle laughter that followed was characteristic of family dinners, where everyone's accomplishments were celebrated, where differences were embraced rather than merely tolerated, where love was measured by presence rather than perfection. Tim, Samuel Clark said during a quiet moment between courses, his voice carrying the dignity that had made him such an effective cultural educator. "I want you to know what your choice has meant to our community. Not just the development fund, though that's been transformational, but your decision to stay, to build a life here, to become family rather than just investor. That showed our young people that Barbados is a place worth building a future in." The comment sparked a conversation about legacy that would have been impossible in Tim's previous life, when success was measured by individual accumulation rather than community contribution. Around the table, 3 generations shared stories about ancestors who'd built lasting things, businesses that employed neighbors, traditions that preserved culture, relationships that created stability across decades. "The real test of development," Asha said, her professional expertise now informed by personal investment in every project, "isn't whether it creates wealth for investors. It's whether it creates opportunities for children to build careers in the communities where they were raised, whether it preserves cultural knowledge while generating economic growth, whether it makes places stronger rather than just more profitable." Tim nodded, thinking about the expansion projects now underway throughout the Caribbean, each one carefully designed to honor local knowledge while providing access to international markets. The model they'd developed in Barbados was being replicated not just in other islands, but in coastal communities throughout the developing world, where tourism could either strengthen or destroy traditional ways of life, depending on how it was managed. "What's our next project?" he asked, knowing that Asher's mind was already working on innovations that would make sustainable tourism even more effective at preserving communities while creating prosperity. "Climate resilience," Maya interjected, her engineering background perfectly suited to addressing the environmental challenges that threatened every coastal community. "We need to integrate environmental protection with economic development. Make sure that tourism infrastructure can withstand hurricanes and sea level rise while protecting the ecosystems that attract visitors in the first place." The conversation that followed would have been impossible in a corporate boardroom, where environmental concerns were typically viewed as obstacles to profit rather than opportunities for innovation. But around this family dinner table, environmental protection was understood as essential to long-term prosperity. Cultural preservation was seen as a competitive advantage, and community benefit was the measure of successful development. As the evening wound down and families began the traditional process of packing leftovers and planning the next week's gatherings, Tim found himself standing in the kitchen with Winston, learning to properly clean the traditional cooking pots that had been in the Greenidge family for 3 generations. "Happy with your choice, son?" Winston asked, as they worked side by side, the question carrying deeper meaning than casual conversation. "Completely," Tim replied, understanding that Winston was asking not just about professional satisfaction, but about life satisfaction, the kind of happiness that comes from building something meaningful with people you love. "I can't imagine any other life now." "Good," Winston smiled, his weathered hands steady as he dried a pot his grandmother had used to cook for her family decades before Tim was born. Because family isn't something you join temporarily. Family is something you choose permanently. Through good times and difficulties, through celebrations and challenges, through all the ordinary moments that make up a lifetime. As if summoned by their conversation, Grace toddled into the kitchen with the confident determination of someone who'd mastered walking and was ready to conquer the world. She raised her arms toward Tim, demanding to be picked up with the imperious charm that had already made her the undisputed queen of the Seabreeze guest house. "Dada," she said clearly, her small hands patting his cheeks as if to make sure he was paying proper attention. "Dada home." Tim felt his chest tighten with an emotion too large for words. Home. Not just a place he lived, but a place he belonged. Not just a house he owned, but a community he'd helped build. Not just a woman he'd married, but a family he'd chosen and been chosen by in return. "Yes, sweetheart," he whispered against Grace's soft hair, breathing in the scent of innocence and possibility. "Dada's home." Outside the kitchen windows, the sun was setting over Bridgetown Harbor in shades of gold and coral that painted the sky like a blessing, like a promise, like a celebration of all the love stories that had begun in this place and all the ones yet to come. Somewhere in the gentle evening breeze, steel drums played music that spoke of resilience and joy, of communities that endured through hurricanes and hardship, of love that chose commitment over convenience and belonging over accumulation. Tim stood in the kitchen that had become the heart of his world, holding his daughter while his wife laughed with her grandfather about some family joke that would become part of their shared history, and realized that this was what he'd been searching for without knowing it. Not just success, but significance. Not just wealth, but worth. Not just a place to live, but a legacy to leave. This was the story he would tell Grace when she was old enough to understand. How a man who'd spent his life running from attachment had found a woman brave enough to test his character, a community generous enough to trust his transformation, and a love strong enough to change everything he thought he knew about what mattered. This was the story he would tell their son when he arrived in 2 months. How sometimes the best investments aren't measured in dollars, but in relationships. How the most successful developments aren't the ones that generate the highest profits, but the ones that create opportunities for families to stay together and communities to thrive. And this was the story that would be told long after he was gone. Not about a developer who conquered Caribbean real estate, but about a man who learned that some things are worth more than money, some places are worth staying for, and some love is worth building an entire life around. My dear real family, if you're still with me, I'd like to answer this in the comments. What's the most important lesson you've learned about what really matters in life? As Grace fell asleep in his arms and Asha began the evening ritual of preparing for another day of building something meaningful together, Tim felt the deep peace that comes from knowing you're exactly where you belong, with exactly the people you're meant to love, doing exactly the work that will outlast your lifetime. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, another island community requesting partnership, another group of investors needing education about sustainable returns, another opportunity to prove that development could strengthen, rather than destroy the places that welcomed it. But tonight was perfect, a family dinner that had become a celebration of choosing each other every day, a community that had learned to measure success by how many people benefit rather than how much money accumulates, a love story that had become part of the foundation, supporting an entire way of life. The Italian leather shoes that had brought Tim running through Caribbean airports in panic were long gone, replaced by sandals appropriate for beach walks with his daughter and garden work with his father-in-law. The briefcase full of acquisition contracts had been replaced by development proposals that created opportunities rather than eliminating them. The man who had been afraid to stay anywhere, afraid to trust anyone, afraid to believe in forever, had become someone who planned his life in generations rather than quarters, who made decisions based on community benefit rather than individual profit, who'd learned that the best inheritance you can leave is a world improved by your presence. In the cottage that had become their home, as steel drum echoes faded into the sound of waves that had witnessed countless love stories, but never one quite like theirs, Tim and Asha settled into the evening routine of a family building something lasting together. Complicated, community-focused, absolutely right. Love had brought Tim to Barbados, but purpose had made him stay. Community had taught him what belonging meant, but family had shown him what forever looked like. Success had once been about accumulation, but now it was about preservation of culture, tradition, relationships, and the kind of prosperity that benefited everyone, instead of just the person writing the checks. As he held his wife and daughter in the cottage where they'd first discovered what it meant to choose each other completely, listening to his mother's gentle breathing in the guest room and Winston's quiet movements in the kitchen, Tim felt complete in a way he'd never imagined possible. This was home. This was family. This was the life he'd been meant to live all along. He just needed the right place, the right people, and the right love to find it. Tomorrow we'll share another story of unexpected love and life transformation. Until then, what's the bravest choice you've ever made for love? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for daily stories that celebrate the power of choosing connection over comfort, community over isolation, and love over everything else that seems important, until you find the one person who makes you understand what actually matters. Like this video if you believe in love that changes everything, and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story that might just change your perspective on what it means to be truly successful. See you tomorrow for another tale of hearts that choose courage over safety, and love that proves some things are worth more than money.